Hey folks, thanks for joining us tonight. We're getting started. We're going to be talking about PowerShell remoting this evening, and we're going to be specifically talking about the security involved with PowerShell remoting, the logging options, and the configuration that's needed to set it up correctly. So the way this works is I'll be presenting tonight. We have a chat. You're welcome to ask questions in the chat or just open up your mic, ask the questions. There's no predefined breaks in our meeting to say, hey, questions. I'll try to remember to take some breaks occasionally and ask if anybody's got questions. But honestly, if there's something you have a question about the slides or the talk that I'm doing, feel free to just chime in and I'd be happy to answer your questions. Let's get started here. So just to give you guys a quick rundown, normally what I tell people when we have meetings is our meetings are not supposed to teach you like a training class how to do something. They're mostly idea starters that you take back to work and then you can kind of put more time into and learn more about a topic. Tonight's a little different. We're going to be talking about the specifics of configuring remoting, specifically security and logging. So tonight is a little bit more like a training session. I'm going to do some demos in the beginning, and then when we get to the things about logging, it's a lot of slides because it's config information and it's mostly done with group policy. So I apologize if you guys get a lot of slides tonight, but the point here is that you should be able to go from 0 to configuring logging by the end of this thing if you follow along here. It's not that tough. If you have questions, I'll be happy to answer it, but let's get started. All right, so as I said, my name is Mike Kanakos. We're going to be talking about PowerShell remoting, the security and logging aspects. If you'd like to know a little bit about myself, I work for MetLife. I'm an AD engineer. I try to use PowerShell every day at work. I do a number of things in the community. I write. You can reach me via Twitter and email. I share all my code out on GitHub. I also do a lot of stuff with PowerShell.org. And this topic that I'm talking about tonight is a subset of the topic that I wrote for the PowerShell Conference Book Volume 2, which has been released, but my chapter has not been released yet. That will be coming up soon. So if you needed more information, take a look at that book. I also have articles on my website on securing PowerShell, differences between WMI and SIM, and lots of other things related to this topic. And as I said earlier, if you have any questions, you can reach out to me via Twitter or email. I'd be happy to help you with anything that you may have questions about. So what are we going to talk about today? Today, we're going to go through what is remoting, right? So the security and the logging aspects, as I mentioned, but while we're doing that, we're going to do some level setting. I'll talk about what actually is remoting, how sessions are created, how you enable remoting, and how you authenticate in PowerShell for remoting. We'll talk about how to control and a bunch of control access to our remote nodes, and then we're going to spend a decent amount of time talking about logging of PowerShell activity. And last but not least, maybe I'll give you some tips on how you may want to present this to your InfoSec team if you're having challenges getting remoting enabled in your environment. It's something I had to do with my previous employer, and it's a useful conversation that you may want to be prepared for. And at that point, I'd like to open it up because I think maybe other people on this call may have struggled with the same thing. So maybe it's a good group talk. So let's get started. The first thing I'm curious about is, have you had a conversation like this already in your organization? Basically, this is a situation that I was involved in where I wanted to get PowerShell remoting enabled for my company. And my security lead was very hesitant. Now, he didn't say these things exactly that are on the screen, but they were very close to this. To my benefit, my security person said, look, I know you know what you're doing, but I'm just telling you that I can't mess this up. So I need you to do the work and figure out how we can set this up and turn on remoting safely, because everything I hear in the news is that people are exploiting PowerShell for all kinds of bad stuff. So I can't screw it up. I need you to do the work and figure out how. And that is really the genesis of how this talk got started. It was my work that I had to do to figure out how we could set up remoting in my organization and make my security team and the execs feel safe that we were doing something that wasn't a mistake. So, you know, if you were working in IT 5 or 7 years ago and you had some magical way to disappear from the world and not be involved in IT, and then you came back today, you would realize that the IT world has changed quite a bit. You know, I don't know that I would have ever thought that I would see that Microsoft is saying that they love Linux. You know, today it's all about DevOps now, CI/CD pipelines and automation, Azure DevOps, the cloud, the command line is cool again, at least in the Windows world. And, you know, I don't know anybody who's ever told me that they have less VMs to manage, but now those VMs are running in the cloud. They're running on-prem, the different OSs. They could be halfway around the world. And the point I bring up with all these things is, since the IT world has changed and how OSs have changed, we need to change the way we manage our machines. And that solution for managing machines, one of the solutions is PowerShell remoting. And this topic got a lot of activity when we put this online. And what I think, and the reason I give this talk, is that even though remoting is a pretty simple idea, there's a lot of people that don't understand how it works, and maybe they're not even sure how to get started. So I do this talk to get people started. What I'm going to talk about tonight is certainly not all the information related to remoting, not even close, but it's a good starter to get you going in the right direction. And then there's more information you could pull down later on to kind of figure out the advanced concepts. So when we talk about remoting specifically, there are ways to remote to computers that are not PowerShell blessed, if you were looking for a term. For example, we've all connected to machines and queried information with PSRemoting. You can run scripts, batch scripts in VBS. There's programs that do remote shell, VNC, and RDP. None of that is remoting. And if you've ever used any like WMI commands, that's not even considered remoting. And the reason I mention that is remoting is very specific. You need to be doing, when you want to connect to remote computers, you need to be using the SIM commandlets in order to be using remoting. And also invoke command also uses PSRemoting. And I'll explain that more. So unless you've connected to a remote computer using the SIM commandlets, invoke command through a SIM session, or anything like that, you haven't done PowerShell remoting. And PowerShell remoting is more secure than anything that's come before it in the Windows world. It's akin to SSH in the Linux world. So remoting is built in on everything from Windows 8 and forward, and I think 2008 R2, SP2 and forward. I might be wrong about the 2008, but it's definitely Windows 8 and forward. So that's 8, 10, Windows Server 2012, 2016, 2019, as well as built into the cloud. So if you're doing Azure, there's PowerShell remoting built in there that you can leverage. And what remoting basically means is that you're using the Windows Remote Management Service, WinRM. That's a service that runs on your box. And that service handles the connections between machines for us. And that service runs on top of the WSMAN protocol. WSMAN means Windows, Web Services Management Protocol. And that protocol runs over HTTP and HTTPS, 5985 and 5986. Now, there are certain well-known ports that everybody has sort of committed to memory, RDP, DNS, things like that. I think 5985 and 5986 are going to be ports that you're going to come very familiar with as time progresses and people learn to use remoting more and more. And even though that data is traveling over HTTP and HTTPS all the time, anytime data is transferred with remoting, it's encrypted. And it's encrypted with a 256-bit encryption key. So out of the box, remoting is very safe in its default configuration. But the truth is, not everybody has remoting figured out yet. So what you're looking at on the screen here, if you're not familiar with it in the environment that I work on, we have core servers running. And there are guys who are running RDP to a core server and running a local PowerShell prompt. Now look, there's nothing wrong with doing that. That is not the way Windows Core was designed to work. Windows Core is designed to work specifically with remoting. So running RDP to run a local PowerShell session, while it's okay, is not a great idea, because whatever vulnerabilities you have with RDP, you're now introducing into a system like Core that really is meant to be stripped down as much as possible. So I understand it. If not everybody understands today how to use remoting in their environment. That's really the whole point of this conversation. So how does remoting work? So let's talk about that a little bit here. So I am going to give you a little demo here. So in this example, I'm going to show you this is our local machine. And this over here is going to be our remote machine that we want to connect to. So there's 4 pieces to this remoting puzzle that you need to know. It's not the only 4 pieces involved, but it's the 4 pieces that are critical for you to understand. And we're going to walk through that. So the first thing here is you're going to open up a PowerShell command prompt on your machine. You're going to open up a PowerShell session to work with here. So when you do that, you're authenticated. How are you authenticated? It runs as the local user that you're logged in as. So you control or delete it into the machine in the morning. We know who you are. If you right click and run that PowerShell session as another user, right click run as other user, we know who you are. You're authenticated. If you run commands inside your PowerShell session and you do the -credential parameter, we know who you are. The point here is that when this session is running, this is not anonymous. We know exactly who it is that's running commands here. And when we want to connect to this machine, we're going to be authenticated over here. And we're going to be authenticated based on Active Directory. PowerShell remoting is built in to work directly with Active Directory in a domain situation. And when we are doing that authentication, we're going to figure out the privileges that a user has on this remote machine. And the privileges that you have on the remote machine is going to decide what you're able to do. So we're going to query the local group membership on this remote machine when we make our session. So when we do that, now I want to clear one thing up here. This diagram makes this look like a VPN tunnel, and that is not true. This is a session, okay? And this session is running over 5985 and 86, as I mentioned, more so 5985. And as I mentioned, this is 256-bit encryption. When you authenticate over here, you are authenticated with Kerberos, the default protocol inside of Active Directory, so very secure. And what's going to happen is you're going to type commands on your local machine, and those commands are going to be sent over across the wire to the remote session, and they're going to be processed here on the remote machine, and then those results will be sent back to your local session, and that data will be brought back, will be reassembled and presented in whatever format is native for the commands that you ran. So this is the same exact process that happens whether you do this for 1 machine or 1,000 machines. Something called PowerShell run spaces is what manages all this behind the scenes, but you don't have to know any of that. PowerShell does all the work for you. You make your connection over to a remote machine, data is sent, and then data is sent back. And I mentioned earlier that the specific commandlets that are PSRemoting commandlets. So any commandlet that you see on the screen here uses PSRemoting in some way, shape, or form. The ones that I've highlighted in yellow are probably the commands that you will use the most or get your feet wet with PowerShell remoting. So we can make a new session, we can get session information, we can enter into a session interactively, we can connect, obviously. There's SIM sessions. And then if we just want to run commands against a machine, but not interactively, that's invoke command. So any of these commands that you see on the screen right here, when you're using these commands, you're using a remoting. If you're not using one of these commands, it's not remoting. So if you're running Get WMI Object, you're not officially doing PowerShell remoting. So how do you know if a remoting is on your machine? How do you turn it on? Well, these slides here that I'm showing you, we need to take a step back for a second and know that from Windows 8 on, PowerShell remoting is on by default. If you wanted to turn it on, you can do it from an administrative command prompt or from a Windows PowerShell command prompt. These 2 commands take you to the same end result. they do it in a different way. From an administrative command prompt, you can type WinRM quick config, and this will tell you the status of the machine. So over here, it says WinRM services already running on the machine. WinRM is not set up to allow remote access. The following changes must be made. Do you want to make them? Sure. The short answer is you run WinRM quick config, you say yes, it will configure your machine for remoting. Enable PSRemoting does the same thing, but just a little bit different. It doesn't tell you the current status. It just goes ahead and enables it. If you're asking it to enable it, it's going to do it. It's not going to tell you the current status. But at the end result in both of these things here, you're going to have three things that happen. The WinRM service is going to be started. You're going to get a firewall hole poked in your client firewall for 5985 and 5986. And your machine in a domain situation is going to be set to accept incoming connections. So that's important. And we're going to talk about the firewall and the incoming connections piece later on. But the end result is when you do enable PSRemoting, your machine is set up to accept incoming connections. Initiating connections is a different story. So this talk is going to be about the configuration. But before we get to the configuration, I would like to show you guys a little bit of what remoting looks like in case you've never seen it before. So this is a machine I have running in Azure. This is a DC, and I have two member servers. Member server names are server 1 and server 2, server 01 and server 02. The machine I'm on is DC01. Very simple stuff. So what we're going to do here is we are going to run through a bunch of different scenarios here and to show you just simply what remoting looks like if you've never seen it. So there's one command that I did not mention to you and you have not seen before, which is called test WSMan. And this is similar to that enable PSRemoting. What test WSMan does is it allows you to test if remoting is set up, specifically WSMan is set up on your machine. So when I do this, I get an answer. When I get an answer, that means I'm set up. So this means on my machine, DC01, WSMan is set up and ready to go. I can then do this on remote machines. Okay, now, I'm not going to do it here, but there is the dash credential here. Because remember when I said when you make a session, or you attempt to make a session, you're authenticated. And based on your credentials and your group membership, what you can do on that remote machine is determined. So if you have no permissions on a remote machine, this test would fail. So if you know that you're going to be connecting with credentials that won't work and you want to connect with alternate credentials, you would use dash credential. So we're just going to take you through a couple of scenarios here so you see what this looks like. And you will see these are simple commands that with a little bit of practice, if you've never done this stuff, you can pick up very quickly. So I already ran these first two here. All right, let's just do the second one just so you guys can see. Okay. Okay, so this tells me WSMan is responding on this server and on this server. Okay, so now I mentioned interactive command prompt earlier. So when you are using remoting, you can invoke commands, which means send them to the other machine, send them back to me, or I can enter the interactive session on a remote machine. And that's called enter PS session. So let's take a look at that guy. So if we go enter PS session to this here, you're going to see here that my command prompt will change. And this, so now you can see I have the same command prompt I had before, but if you notice, it tells me I'm on server 01. So now if I do commands, I'm actually typing them on the remote machine. Okay. This is information that's coming back from my machine. Now I purposely set the time zone different on there so I could show you guys this. So if I go exit PS session and I'm back on my machine, my history is there, but now I'm running this on my machine. You see Eastern Standard Time. So you can see the information is different, showing that we're querying different machines each time. I should have done this. I should have said enter PS session, and I could say, who am I? And you can see I'm running as test mkadmin. Okay, so I can also enter a session with alternate credentials. So let's exit this session for a second. And now let's enter this. Let's create a session on server 2, but with different credentials. Now, when you enter the credential parameter, if you've never done this before and you put a username, you are prompted with a password entry here. And once I'm authenticated, now I have a session on this machine. And you can see here, I'm running as a different user. All right. So this is the basics of remoting. This is what you need to practice if you've never done this before. This is where it all starts, and it builds up from here. But as you see from these commands, it's very simple. It's not a challenging topic to master. And with a little bit of work, you can easily get this. So let's go back here. I'm going to exit this PS session. Okay, so now we're going to change, and then it helps if you type correctly. So let me stop here for 1 second. I can't see the chat because I'm in full screen mode. Is there any questions anybody has about anything I've mentioned to this point? Is there anything anybody wants me to cover?
Hey, Mike, on these commands, when like if you do the test WSMan to a particular server, does that like typical PowerShell where you could put that in a conditional so it you know, it returns true if it's actually
I believe you can. Yeah. So another way that you can do what Chris was just asking, Chris is asking, hey, I want to write a script. And in my script, I want to query a remote machine. And I want to test to make sure that PSRemoting is enabled on that remote machine. So my script just doesn't throw back a bunch of garbage. So you can do test WSMan, or you can do test net connection, which is the command that's built into PowerShell to test a machine, server 01, and I think it's port. Let me make sure I got that right. Port, and then I can say 5985. And what this will do, and then so in a script, you can make this come back as quiet, and you can query, and this will come back with a result. And that's probably better for a script than test WSMan. But the point is they both end up with the same result. You know their state.
That's a great command, Mike, testnet connection. I loved it when they brought that out.
So I apologize. I don't know who was chatting. I recognize the voice, but I need a name. Who was that?
Hey, it's David Ferrer.
Hey, Dave. How are you?
Good. How are you, man?
Yeah.
Hey, thanks. Great session.
Thanks, man.
Earlier in your session, you were talking about some discussions that you've had at work around people being concerned about PowerShell remoting. And when anybody ever brings that up, I find it as a really good platform to have a strategy-based discussion around information security as a whole. Because what is information security? It's managing risk, right? So I think there's so many other things that we could discuss when we talk about someone being worried about PowerShell remoting. There's other examples to use, and I don't always go down that path because I never want to sound, hostile or anything, but it's a good time to ask questions about, for our larger enterprises, how many large enterprises are using Gigamon spanning tree taps? How many large enterprises are putting virtual firewalls for east-west traffic between certain types of VLANs and subnets? So I find it a great way to bundle that into a larger strategical discussion to discuss, and sometimes that makes PowerShell remoting not sound like that big of a deal, right? Because if we really look at it, SSH is pretty much always open to the world, and SSH that's encrypted just like PowerShell remoting is. And so, it kind of, I think a lot of people in the security space seems to be very Linux heavy. And so I find that sometimes there needs to be some socialized awareness provided to those people and kind of inner workings like you're doing a great job of, to kind of socialize that and say, hey, it's not as bad as you think. You're kind of already doing the same thing when you SSH into a Linux server.
That's 100% correct. So I'm actually doing a talk for an InfoSec conference in 2 weeks, and the topic of the talk is going to be remoting, but the topic is going to be called "Don't Fear the Remote Windows Shell," the Windows Remote Shell, because in my eyes,
that's great.
what you just said is really, I feel the same way. What at this point, there are nuances, but what is the real difference between SSH and PowerShell remoting? There are differences, but when you talk about encryption, secure connection, authentication, they're basically the same thing. The Linux version is trusted. Everybody thinks SSH is, sure, you do that, do whatever you want. Remoting, are you crazy? There's no way we'll do remoting. And I think that's because Windows has a connotation of not being secure. So it's not trusted by default. And that's kind of why I did these talks to say, hey, I think you're kind of nuts. And we're going to get into that more. So you kind of beat me to the punch there, but you're 100% right on with that.
Can I say one thing? Can I add
Sure.
one more thing?
Yeah,
For
yeah.
those of you that work in environments, I'm lucky to work in an environment that has something like a Splunk or a Tableau or a really good log aggregation tool. You can write really simple queries and use regex. So when somebody that is doing specific things with PowerShell remoting, it logs it into a specific dashboard, and you can build reports about it to see who does what. And you can also use anomaly detection. So if you work in an area that provides you those types of capabilities, in a company that provides you, you can give them a visualization on what's going on. And when you move on to your PowerShell logging, I'm sure you'll be able to shed some light on what that is.
Yeah, so to take that point a little farther, let's take that down a couple of levels, because let's say companies don't have Splunk, they don't have a really good SIM or something like that. What I'm going to talk about later is how to do some logging, and a lot of the logging is in the event logs. So now, if you've been a member of our group for a long time, Josh King, who's on this call, who may have had to leave, Josh King and Stevie Valdinger, Stevie Coaster have done talks on toast notifications. You can write notifications that read event logs and simply pop up those Windows 10 alerts in the bottom right hand corner. That's a super simple way to do something like that. And Bradley Wyatt, the lazy administrator, did a talk for us earlier this year on sending alerts to Teams channels. So if you don't have the budget for Splunk and all these cool things, you can do a lot with the tools that most of us have. Built-in alerts within your Windows client, Teams notifications, simple email alerts. So everything that Dave just said is 100% true, and you don't have to have $1 million budget to even get into those worlds. It's just obviously easier with those kinds of tools. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But so back to what Chris was asking, which was, how can I make sure this is open? So testnet connection is a really great way to figure out if a port is open. And on a side note, testnet connection is a good command for people to learn because it's more valuable than ping. When you ping something, you're pinging on a specific port, and it's a UDP port, and the other side has to be configured to respond to ping. And very honestly, many websites don't respond to ping. It's shut off on routers, it's shut off on switches, it's shut off. However, if you want to test a port, this is the PowerShell way to do it. So you can say, I want to see if the SQL port is open. I want to see if RTP is open. I want to test. So sometimes that's more valuable than ping, because a machine can be up and not respond to a ping. I digress a little bit. So what we were talking about here was remote sessions. And what I was showing you was using something called Enter PS Session, which was getting an interactive command prompt here. That's probably not the way that most people are going to work when they have to bulk do work. If you need to query a machine to see if a reg key is on there, you enter PS Session, you get the information, that's great. But if you want to do like, hey, I need to deploy this reg key to 200 machines, you're not going to enter into each session, run the command, and then exit. There's an alternate way to do that. And the way that would be to create these sessions on these remote machines, or invoke commands against these remote machines in a batch, and then have all the results come back. And the way that we do that is we create something called PS Sessions. And that's what this command is here. So now, instead of coming in and jumping in and getting a remote command prompt like I had here, I'm just going to do a CLS and clear this out. If I copy this guy and I pop it over here, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to say, hey, I want to create a session to server 1 and server 2. Okay, and now what that has done is created 2 sessions for these 2 machines. And these sessions are open and they'll stay open for a period of time. Now, I'm still at my machine here. I'm not on the remote sessions, but now I can use these sessions in scripts to query information. And now if you're sort of thinking ahead, I got 2 machines here, but I could have done this for 200 machines. I could have done it for 10 machines, and I could have all those sessions queued up for me to go into. I can loop them into a script. I could have a list of computers that I want to run through a for each loop. There's lots of possibilities here. So now you've already seen it on the screen here, but if I want to see what sessions I have, this tells me what sessions I have. If I was to go back up and I run this again, it's going to create 2 more sessions. You see the numbers here, right? So if I go up here and I say get PS session, now I have 2 sessions open to each machine. I'm not sure that I really want to do that, but the point is I'm showing here you can have multiple sessions open to multiple machines, and I still haven't actually connected to any of them. What I've done is authenticated and created the session that I can go back into later. This is like an open state. So now I can save that information to a variable, right? And then $S. And over here, I'm just going to do that. Well, let me try this again. Copy. And now I've saved that information to a variable. So why do I want to do that? So now I can use that in commands, and I can say here. Now this is going to get a little funky because I made 2 sessions to each machine. But when I run this, what this command says here is, hey, invoke command. That's the session to say do something on another machine. Which session? Well, S. I said all the sessions. And in my curly braces here is the code I want to run. So I want to say, hey, go out and get the date from every machine. Now that's maybe a very simple example, but it illustrates that I've gone out to those 4 sessions and pulled that information and pulled it back. So now I can do stuff, right? So let's say, hey, I need to make sure the time zone is set on every machine. I've just set that. So I can go into here. Well, it's not going to work good because I think I had that set already. So let's do this. Eastern. All right, so now if I enter into the server 01 and I say get time zone, okay, I think before that was Pacific. So you see we set that. So think about that for a second. This is not just server stuff. This could be client. This could be a lot of different use cases. Let's say you need to set settings on a bunch of machines. This is a simple example, set the time, but maybe you need to push reg keys to machines. Maybe you need to query information on a bunch of machines. I need to get the BIOS information back. I need to see disk space. I need to pull back information on the file usage. Lots of things you can do. And now I'm not going to each machine. I'm doing it, and I'm having the computer do all the work for me. So if I go here, time zone, we did this already, we did that. And we did this. Get time zone. So I think we did a. So here's another example. Okay, so we're going to take this up a little bit more here to show you exit PS session. So you see there's a little bit of a delay. Remember, we're sending commands. They're being processed, they're being sent back. And in this case, I'm doing it in the cloud. So I don't know what the latency is between nodes. But so now we're going to take that same command that we were doing before and expand it out a little bit. So I apologize, this is a little long, but I'm going to explain it to you. So we're going to do the same thing we did before. We're going to say, hey, invoke command, meaning run on another machine. What machines? Well, all my sessions. All right, and I'm going to say, give me the IP address. Now, this command is a little chatty, because it's going to give me IP4 and IPv6 information. So I've gone ahead and built a filter that said, I know the machine addresses are 10.0 addresses. So only show me the entries that have a 10. Okay. And then I want to pull back something called the PS computer name and the IP address. And when I run this command, you'll understand why I did that. Because if you look up here for a second, we don't know which machines these came back from. So PS computer name is a variable that's created when you use invoke command to keep track of information. So now when I do this, again, we're going to get to see the results twice because I had multiple sessions. But you see here, I now know this address came from this machine, and I mentioned run spaces earlier, right? So you start to see how you can piece together information from remote machines very easily. You can query all that information, and remember, everything in PowerShell is an object. So this is not text on the screen. These are objects that you can query. You can use in scripts. You can pass those along to other things. So it's really powerful. Okay, so I want to clean up now. I've got a bunch of these sessions open and I don't need them anymore. So to do that, I want to remove sessions. So we already assigned all the sessions to a variable before, so I can just call that variable. And now when I remove the session, well, nothing happened on the screen. So now I want to say get PS session. That should have listed some sessions there for me. I'm going to go with it. There are no sessions. All right. The last thing I wanted to show you guys is I mentioned earlier SIM commandlets. I'm going to talk super brief about WMI and SIM instance. There is a difference, but to help you illustrate those points, I want to show an example real quick here. So when you use remoting, you use these commandlets called SIM instance. I'll do a quick explainer of this, but this is going to help me for a point later on. You see I'm quick. Typos. This is why you pre-stage everything. Typos. Okay, the point I'm trying to make here is I ran two different commands, get WMI object and up here get sim instance, and you see I pulled back the same information. So what gives there? I'm telling you that when you do remoting, you need to use the sim commandlets, but hey, I can get the same information with WMI. Why use one over the other? And that's what we're going to talk about here a little bit briefly, but to foreshadow, sim commandlets and WMI commandlets basically the same thing. The difference is that I ran these commands on a local machine. If I was connecting to a remote machine, that's not so easy to do with WMI object, and it requires a lot of ports to be open to do that. SIM instance leverages PSRemoting, and if you remember, I said there's only 2 ports involved, and those ports are encrypted. So it's a much safer and a much easier connection to make using get SIM instance versus its sister command of get WMI object. And that's what we're going to talk about a little bit next. So let me get back into my slide deck here, wherever it went. So that was a quickie demo of how you initiate remote sessions. Does that make sense to everybody? Does anybody have any questions about that? All right. So what I want to talk about now is a little bit about that SIM versus WMI stuff and what is happening with remoting. So before we can do that, we're going to get into authentication here in a little bit. And this is where it can get a little confusing for people. So I built a simple example here to show this, to sort of show that remoting is not the security piece, but really it's the transport piece. And I'll show you what that means in a second. So I've built this example. This is just any old network. It's connected by Ethernet. And we have a number of machines in the network, and they're connected to each other. How they are, it doesn't really matter. However, in this example, this green lock represents security. And by security, I mean each one of these machines are configured very securely. It's very hard to make a connection from this machine to this machine, okay? And I'm just going to tell you that in this example, you can't make a connection. There is nothing that allows it, okay? So if I try to remote from here to here or here to here, it fails, all right? Now, if I go and I change the end node security here, okay, and I take away all that security and I replace it with super weak security, it's wide open, okay? And I now want to make a remote connection, it works. And why does that work? Did we change anything with remoting? And the answer is no, we didn't. What we changed is the security at the end node. And when you're talking about remoting, that's the key thing to understand because the security that you have in place on your end nodes you're going to connect to is going to dictate the security in your network. Remoting is the road to get you there. And what happens when you get there depends on the end machine. So if you want to go visit your friend, you might jump in the car and get on the road and drive to his house. Let's assume you're not super great friends and you just don't walk into his house. You knock on the door. He figures out who's at the door. You're okay. He lets you in. That's what's happening with remoting. So I bring this up because people want to know, is it safe to enable remoting in my environment? And this is where the gut check happens. If you work in an environment where everybody is a local admin on their machine, you do not want to turn on remoting because you have no security, because everybody's going to be allowed to make every connection. If you work in an environment where your help desk is admins on every machine, maybe not a great idea. If you work in an environment where you have a ton of domain admins, not a great idea. But in all these scenarios, remoting is not the issue. Remoting is the way that I got from machine A to machine B. When I got to machine B, because I had unlimited privileges, remoting just let me in. So when we talk about remoting security, it's not remoting that is your problem. It's your security on your end nodes. And that's what you need to work on. So we talked about PowerShell authentication. I had mentioned local PowerShell session authenticates against a remote session. And I said that happens when you use these commandlets. I also said that when you get to the remote machine, your identity is confirmed. Your local group membership on a remote PC determines what you can do. So again, if you're an admin on every machine, you're going to be able to make a connection everywhere. Why do people like PowerShell? Because it's super powerful, allows you to do your job, and lets you query lots of information quickly. It's the same reason malware writers, script kiddies, black hats like PowerShell. So if you want to secure your network, you need to take care of your security on the machines they're going to connect to. And we'll talk about that more. But I mentioned earlier that remoting is built to work with Active Directory. It works on top of Kerberos. It's going to use local group membership to figure out what you can and can't do. It does work in a workgroup situation. It relies on NTLM, or you can set it up to use SSL. We're not going to talk about that tonight, but I just want to let you know that it is a possibility. So we talked about local group membership. Here's where it all comes together. I think everybody understands administrators. You're an administrator, you get full access to the machine. Let's go and think about RDP for a second. If you don't have admin access on a machine, you can't RDP to a machine unless you're in remote desktop users. And when you get remote desktop users, you get read access, right, to the desktop. The same concept exists for PowerShell. So if you're an admin, and by the way, remoting is designed to be used for admins, not for Susie in accounting, not for Joe in marketing or the facilities guy. It's meant for admins. So it's assumed that admins have access. If you want to give remoting access to someone who's not an admin, that's what the remote management users group is for. And it says right there, members of this group can access WMI over WSMan, Windows Remote Management. Some people have never even seen this group exists. Just know that if you need to give read access to someone, this group is your friend. When I say read access, that means people are going to be able to use the get commandlets. They're going to be able to query information. They won't be able to set or change information on a remote machine. All right. Now, let's go back here for a second. You can connect to each machine and you could put people in the remote management users group. Ain't nobody going to do that in a domain environment. If you're going to do that, you're going to use group policy. So let's talk about, if we want to configure this stuff in group policy, how the heck do we get it done? We have three things we need to do. So I told you that enabling remoting is on by default, but if you need to configure it and force it on, there's three things you need to do. You need to enable that WinRM service. You need to set it to Autostart. You need to punch a hole through the firewall, the Windows client firewall. By the way, the Windows client firewall is your friend, as we're going to see in a little bit. If you're not using it, you're putting yourself at a huge disservice here. So you want to consider running Windows client firewall in your environment, at least on your servers. So very quickly, we're going to run through how to do this in group policy. It's very simple. Here's the location. where you would configure this setting. This is to turn on WinRM, enable, disable, with setting a service. It's that simple. There's not much to do. There is this IP4, IPv6 filter that I'm going to come back to and talk about in a little bit. But if you want to turn on WinRM, it's either on or off. And here's the path to where it is. The next one, equally as similar. Whoops. Oh, I'm sorry, I got lost there. This next setting is setting the service to auto start. It's probably set to auto start already, but if you want to force it on your environment, same thing. Here's the path, automatic, manual, disabled. This is all standard Windows stuff. And you see it's just in group policy, super easy to do. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. Okay. Microsoft's made it super simple to poke a hole in the firewall. It's a predefined rule. You just drop down the thing, say I want to apply Windows remote management, and then you're off and you're running. And here's the setting. Now remember, this is all group policy stuff. So you can set this at the domain level. You can set it at a group level, at an OU level. You can make a custom group. You can apply it to a number of individual machines. You have plenty of options here. So this is how you can get super creative with remoting in your environment, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit. All right, before I talk about getting access to remote nodes, I'll stop here and see if anybody is lost, has questions, anything they want to talk about. I'm going to jump in and take a look at what's going on in the chat. Hey, Mr. Feliz, I'm going to mention Gia a little later, but that is way over the topic of what I'll be talking about today, but that is an excellent point. So Lewis in the chat has mentioned that there's a technology called Gia, Just Enough Administration, which takes remoting to the next level. I'll mention that a little bit at the end, but what that means is right now we're talking about, hey, you either get access to a machine or you don't. Gia says, well, when you get to that machine and I give you access, I want to control what commands you can run. So even though you're an admin on this machine, you connected via Gia, I want you to just be able to run 3 commandlets. So that's the next step after this remoting talk on like how you can really customize remoting and security. Does remoting work in PS7? Yes, it does. And PowerShell 7 leverages PowerShell 6, leverages Linux. PowerShell 7 is Windows and Linux. So when you're PowerShell remoting and you want to go between 2 different environments, you now can use SSH to connect to your Linux hosts. Now, there's a caveat that comes in here. PowerShell is an object-based language. What comes back is objects. Linux is a text-based language. So some commandlets don't work if they don't exist in the Linux world. So you have to be aware of that. But making the connection is possible. Kevin Lux, one of the leaders of our group who's on this call, has talked about this in a previous session, and he knows a lot more about connecting via remoting to Linux than I do. So you can chat him up if you have questions about that. Good talk. Okay. All right, so let's keep moving on. So I apologize if I'm killing you guys with slides here, but this stuff is just not very demo friendly. Where's my slides? So I pre-recorded all this stuff into slides to make it easy. So now, how do you control who gets access to a machine? We talked about that remote management users group, right? That's one way you can do that because administrators are automatically assigned through domain admin, where you can populate a group into the local administrators group. So this example here is a little bit bad. It's a slide I grabbed off the internet. There's a domain called R2. That's a bad name for a domain and it could be confusing, but someone went and created a group in AD called PowerShell Remoting. Okay, and what they're saying is I want to add this domain group to this local group on the machine. And remember, because it's group policy, I could be adding this to 1 or 1,000 machines. So this is how you can give read access to a lot of machines really quickly via group policy by creating a domain-based group using group policy to apply it to your local groups on the local built-in groups. Here's where the setting exists in group policy. Super simple. I'm going to talk about this more in a little bit. Now let's come back to the IP4 filter and the IP6 filter, because this is where it gets super granular and really interesting. So I have to give you guys an example for you to think about this for a second. Let's say we have a network of 500 machines. Let's say we have an IT staff of 30 people. Okay, we could make the assumption that out of those 500 machines or 500 employees, let's say, the only people that ever need to initiate a remote connection are the 30 admin staff. So if I could shut off the ability of the other 470 people to be able to initiate a connection, I have drastically reduced my attack surface. Now let me clear that up for a second. When you turn on the Windows Remote Management Service, you are saying, I want to accept connections. When you are talking about who can initiate connections, this is what we're going to talk about here a little bit. So what we're saying here is with this IP4 filter, we can control who can start a session. And how are we doing that? This is being deployed with our Windows Client Firewall. So remoting is not actually changing any settings. We have a firewall up in front of that Windows Remote Management Service that's saying, I'm not going to let you in because you're not on a pre-approved list. So the way this works is if I wanted to, let's say I have 30 admins, I could stick them all on one VLAN, 10.0.1.x. And I could say 10.0.1.x here. And that says I will only accept, and then I deploy this to all my machines. Those machines will only accept connections from computers running on 10.0.1.x. I could put ranges of IPs in here. I could put specific IPs in here. I can do lots of different things, right? So this is the way that you start to scale down your environment and make it so that just a specific set of people or machines can start connections in your environment. So we don't care that every machine is configured to receive connections. That client firewall is going to step in and save our butts and say, I only wanted my 10 or 20 or 30 admins to be able to initiate connections. Let's take this a step further. Maybe you don't have one VLAN. Maybe you don't have a bunch of IPs that you want to have to type in. Let's say you want to go even farther. Maybe you have this tiered access model in your environment. You could put the IP addresses in here of some jump boxes. I only want my jump boxes to be able to make connections to remote machines. So now you can see, even though we've turned on remoting everywhere in environment, it's an encrypted connection. We're authenticating users, and now we're limiting who can make connections from where. So depending how far you want to go with remoting and IP filtering, authentication, you can make remoting as wide open or as dialed down as you want. So this part can be confusing. So I'll take a quick breath here. Does anybody have any questions about this? All right, let's keep on moving.
Can I just make a comment about that, Mike?
Sure.
And this goes back to some of your, when you were talking about having the discussion with security teams about turning on remoting. One of the things that in my environment is we're, as you know, we're big ServiceNow users, and we use the ServiceNow CMDB and Discovery for that. And everyone loves, especially managers and application teams love it because you can get a lot of information about machines through ServiceNow Discovery. All of that is using PowerShell. ServiceNow deploys and uses PowerShell scripts on their discovery engines, and uses WMI or WinRM. And I'm trying to make the case that, well, we should really just be using WinRM because it's a lot more secure. And it's also, I found, a lot more reliable than doing WMI, which I think uses RPC as the communication to the individual servers. And I find a lot of people don't realize that those discovery engines that's providing all that great information automatically through the CMDB is actually using PowerShell under the covers. And if you don't have WinRM enabled, you're really doing a disservice of getting all you can out of those types of auto discovery engines.
That's a good point. Hold on, guys. I'm just responding. So, Jeremy, are you on? You're on the call. Can you chat for a second?
Yeah, what's up?
So let's just talk about what you were talking with me. That's setting the client firewall what's going to accept connections from.
Yeah, so I was just wanting to say that because you were saying, go back a couple slides.
Sure. If I got it wrong, please correct me.
No, sorry, go for it. One more. Yeah, this one is the listener. So you don't want to set it to star, but you will need to include any of the IPs that any client you want to ever remote to would be on. So this one's setting WS man up for what the service will listen on. So an example would be if I had a server that was multi-homed and it had 2 NICs and two subnets, but I only want to be able to manage it from one of those subnets, I won't include the subnet that I don't want management coming from, like a DMZ subnet or something like that, in this list. And by excluding that one out of the list, I can only manage it from the other NIC. So that's going to be a big block of IPs right there. The way that you would limit it to keep it so that only my 30 admins can connect to all of my 500 computers is using the Windows firewall.
So I got the slide wrong here, but that's what I was trying to say, which is limit at the firewall, but this is not the firewall slide then.
Correct. Yeah, that's what I was saying. Like when you were talking, you flipped your words is all you did.
Okay.
You got it all right. You flipped your words.
All right. So the point being is that client firewall is what's going to save your bacon from allowing anyone to connect to that machine. You can configure that in remoting, but it's harder. You want to use that client firewall as a filter for yourself. So Jeremy, thanks for the clarification. And Chris, you're right, what you're saying. And we're going to talk about this a little bit later on. It's amazing when you turn on logging, when you see how much uses PowerShell and remoting and just PowerShell in general. So Chris is right. As more and more of these services come online and leverage PowerShell, you need to do this more and more. So you need to figure out how to do this safely. So Chris, in your environment, we have the servers set up to accept connections from a limited set. That's how it's set up. And that's all I'll say in public. Okay, so back to where we were. So quick little summary here. Enabling remoting service, set it to Autostart, configure your firewall exceptions. Then you decide who gets access, and you can do that group policy. You can decide where connections can be initiated from through client filtering, client firewall filtering. And then add all that together. You have to decide how you can deploy all that stuff. I think almost anybody's going to do GPO, but you could also do this to command line scripts or a combination of both. So that's all about setting up remoting and controlling the authentication method, turning on the services. As Lewis mentioned in the chat a little earlier, this is a concept of GIA. So I've been talking almost exclusively about authenticating users, and I mentioned there's 2 ports, 5985, 5986. 5986 comes into play when we introduce certificates and SSL. And that's obviously the next thing that you would want to do, because while we're authenticating the user, we also want to make sure that the computer, we know who that is, right? Somebody's got to mute their mic. I'm hearing all kinds of clicking. GIA, just enough administration or just-in-time access. There's a couple of different ways it's called, but GIA is configuring a connection to a remote machine, and when that machine gets to the when the connection gets to that remote machine, you limit down what they can do. So just because someone is an admin doesn't mean you want them to be an admin on every machine. So you can say, when you connect, I'm going to only give you 10 commands. As I mentioned, certificates, SSL will get you onto that 5986 port as well, and you'll take it a step farther. Now, I've also read that you can configure using SSL as your authentication method rather than Kerberos. I don't know much about that. I do know that SSL can be used as an authentication method for work computers as well, but it's a little over my head. And then the last piece of all of this is, sure, we got all this remoting set up and we got all these people connecting. You need to log this activity because you want to be able to tell what's happening. And that's kind of where we're going to go next. And this is a much shorter conversation, so we'll be done here not too much farther from now. So I appreciate you sticking with me. But this is sort of the part 2 to the part 1 I just talked about. When we talk about logging, there's 3 ways to do it. So you can do module logging, script block logging, and transcription. And I will just say now that there is no right way to do this. You're going to have to figure out what works for you. I'll point out what these things do, but this is a little bit of black magic. Security guys are going to tell you turn them all on. I don't know if that's the right thing. There's impacts to these things, CPU overhead, log size restrictions you got to think about. So this is not just like turn it all on, walk away. You got to think about this because this is where it can get a little bit interesting. So the first one, I started with module logging because this guy is the one that produces the most noise from everything I've read. I have not used module logging specifically myself because I use script block logging in my environment. But let me explain this to you. So let's say you have a module of commands that you want to run. The Active Directory module, for example, or the SQL module. You can say, I want to turn on logging for all commands for that module. And anything that is invoked from those commands is written to the PowerShell log. Now, with all this logging, if you're not used to logging, you got to get used to dealing with some big numbers because these logs can and will blow up your logs, blow up the log sizes on your machines. And here's the important thing. If you don't set your log sizes big enough and the logs roll over, you might as well not even have logging on at all. Because if the information is not there when you go to look for it, there was no benefit that came. You might as well have just had logging shut off. So the point being is if you want to be able to go back and look at the history as to what happened, you need to account for that in your logs so that there's enough history for you to go back to. Now, earlier in the conversation, Dave mentioned Splunk and like enterprise logging tools in a SIM. If you have a SIM, you want to sweep these logs off and let the SIM hold the archive. That is totally the way to go. There's a lot of people who don't have SIMs, so you're going to have big logs to keep a couple of days of activity, and we'll talk about some other things we can do later. All 3 of these settings for logging are in the same spot. They're right here, right? And you can see turn on module logging, script block logging, transcription. We're going to get to all of these, and it's on or off. It's very simple, right? So here's what it looks like when you turn it on. When I turn on module logging, I enable it, and down here, I pick the module that I want to enable auditing for. And when I do that, and I deploy that via group policy in this case, and it gets activated on the machines, what you're going to do is you're going to get log entries that look like this. So in this above screenshot, someone's running the get SMB share commandlet. Remember, we said we want to do it for the SMB share module. So when they run the get SMB share commandlet, when this information is displayed on the screen, it is logged here. Okay, and you can see this command was run, who ran it, this is what they ran. Okay, and regular logging information. You see where it's contained here in the logs. What you don't see is the output of the command. Moving on to script block logging, this is probably what most people are going to do because this is the generic logging. Script block logging is, remember those curly braces on PSRemoting? Anything in the script block in PSRemoting or any command that I run, that's all the script block. That's all going to be logged. So it logs blocks of code as they're executed. They're written to the event log, very definite IDs. You can query for this stuff. Like Dave said, you can set alerts. Lots of cool stuff you can do. Now, here's the really interesting thing. What most people don't know is that this is on already in your environment and you just don't know it. So what I mean by that is Microsoft has done a lot of analytics and they have recognized that there's certain kinds of code that is run by black hats, malware writers, script kiddies, the bad guys, whatever you want to call them. They use certain techniques that nobody would normally use. And they've figured out there's some patterns that happen. They have said anything that matches those patterns, we're going to log. So I would encourage you to go look at your logs. And if you see some script block stuff being logged and you know that it's off, you have some interesting stuff happening in your environment. So when we say that we're turning this on, we're basically going past this basic logging to full logging. So this doesn't produce as much as module logging, but it's still going to be a lot. So in all cases, big logs are your friend here. And I'm going through these quick because there's not too much to them. As I told you, set these settings here, same location, on, off. Here's what it looks like. We're going to enable this. And we have one option here to log start and stop events, which I will explain in 1 second. You turn it on, you apply it to your machines, it starts logging. All right. Here's what a log looks like. So you can see here, I ran the get Windows feature command. This is the script that ran it. Here's my user. Here's some more useful information. All right. Before we jump onto this guy, we talked about the start and stop events. Let me explain that a little bit. So you enable script block logging in your environment. Someone sets up a session and they're running commands. Okay. This is going to log commands. It's going to log events and it's going to truncate the logs based on size. So if I run something that's 500 lines, that might take up 10 log entries, for example. However, how many people come in the morning, fire up a PowerShell session and leave it open all day? Maybe a lot of people do. How would you know when a session is start and stopped when it comes to logging? So that's what this does here. This is going to tell you when a script block was invoked or stopped. So I use that example of 500 lines of code. If you have to take your logs and you have to reassemble them to see all 500 lines of code that were run, how would you know where to start? How would you know where to stop? That's what this is going to do. This is going to tell you when the start of a command, a set of commands is run, and when a stop of a set of commands is run. So this is not a requirement, but I would recommend that if you're going to do script block logging, you probably want to fire this guy off here. All right. Now, this guy here, transcription, is probably the weirdest one of them all. And it's kind of hard to figure out a use case for it. But if you've ever used start transcript, that's transcription. Turning it on via GPO is basically saying, I want to run start transcript on every user that runs every command, or however you configure that. All right, so what it does is it creates a unique record of every PowerShell session, including all the input and output. It's pretty cool because you get to see exactly what the person saw on their screen. However, before we were writing stuff to logs, this is writing it out to text files. And it's broken out by user and session. So you probably are wondering, what the hell would I want to write stuff out to text files for? So remember, transcription has a different use case than the other ones. If you don't have a SIM and you can't set up big logs, maybe this is your only choice for logging. So let me show you a way that you can use this. So a way that you may want to use this is you may want to have all the logs written to a specific directory that's locked down on each local machine. So that, think of it like a Dropbox. I can write to a directory. I can't get in and read that directory. And I secure that. And then I could create a scheduled task that grabs those logs off the local machine and dumps them up to a share, or dumps them up to some other location, right? And then maybe I have a scheduled task that runs on that server that's serving up the share, that compresses the logs, zips them, moves them off to another location, or after they're backed up to tape, or they're deleted. The point is, it gives you options that you don't have with logging to logs, to the event logs. So this is what it looks like. You enable, disable. You say where I want to set the logs to write to. Invocation headers will tell you the start and stop of events. So that's useful. We'll talk about that in a second. And here's what it looks like. So if you were to run on your computer, you could say start transcript on your machine. We do the exact same thing of this. Start transcript is a command you can use to say, whatever I type from this point forward, record. And I say stop transcript to stop recording. This is doing it behind the scenes without the user knowing. So transcript start time, user, run as, machine, processes, and look at this. Here's that command, verbatim. So you see, this has a different use case than the other logging. And that's why I said there's no right answer as to what is the thing to use. So the start time here is what that invocation header was for. Tells you when things were started. If someone had a session open and you're recording data over a length of time, you might want to know when that session started, right? And again, at the end, it's not shown here, but when a session was stopped. So bring this all together. 3 different options for logging. 2 write to the event logs, 1 writes to flat text files. Whatever you do, this stuff writes a lot of data. You need to plan for that. So big logs. And remember, transcription logs are going to record everything. So if you don't secure that, API keys, passwords, usernames, server names, client connect strings, all that stuff is going to be saved to your logs. So if you're going to do transcription, you really need to make sure you have all your ducks in a row, because you're going to be recording a lot of sensitive information possibly. And the last thing I will say is that what Chris alluded to about 10 minutes ago is when you turn on logging and you start to realize how many things in your environment are using remoting or just PowerShell in general, you could get a lot of logs, like a needle in a haystack situation. So you're gonna have to figure out the right combination of logging for you. There is no right one. I would say if you're gonna start somewhere, you start with script block logging. So now if we go back to the very beginning, we'll bring this all together. How secure remoting is really depends on how much work you want to put into your configuration. You can turn it all on and you can leave it wide open. You can dial it down through IP filtering, client firewalls, accepting connections, group membership. Just know that PSRemoting is secure by default, out of the box, set up with 256-bit encryption. Everything is encrypted. Everything is authenticated. Kerberos is the protocol behind the scenes that does all the heavy lifting. So you should feel confident going to your security team to say, hey, this is something that is not going to blow up in our faces. With all the logging that is included, you can keep very close details on what is happening on the environment if you need to. You could capture nearly every command that is typed, but you have to decide if you want to do that. There is penalties to be paid for that level of detail. It's CPU overhead, memory, and disk churn, right? As I said, there's no one size fits all. You got to figure out the right settings for you. But I hope you understand that remoting is safe. And if you haven't started using it, you need to be looking into it. So I wanted to finish up with how do we sell this to our teams, right? So we've been on this call a long time, and I'm sorry this is a long one, but I want to open this up here because this is not just my viewpoints. There's other people that have gone through this, right? I'll just tell you what I had to deal with, right? I think if you want to talk about how to get this enabled in your environment, you need to know all the pieces and you need to be able to talk about them confidently. Your security team is never going to get behind what you're doing if you don't know how this stuff works. Your security team takes all the risk by letting you run these things. They're not going to let you do it if they don't believe that you know what you're doing. This diagram here is what happens when they say no to remoting. When you say no to remoting, they just go to something else. They go around the roadblock, right? So that works for you and that works for your attackers. The reason you want to be using remoting is because it's one of the few tools that Microsoft has given us that has almost unlimited potential for logging, auditing, and security. You don't have that in RDP, in other methods of connecting, in just general usage. So we should be embracing remoting because not only does it let us do our jobs better, but we can really watch what's happening in the environment and we can get super granular with the settings. So we shouldn't be fearing remoting. We should be trying to force our users that are admins to use remoting because then we can really control what they're doing, right? As I said, if you're selling this, you want to highlight PowerShell is one of the most configurable and auditable options available from Microsoft. It's better than anything that they've had before it. Most people consider it an equal to SSH. And if SSH is blessed in your environment, then remoting should be too. And you need to make the team aware that the other choices available by not doing remoting are worse for the InfoSec team because they're going to have less visibility. And as long as you understand at the end of the day that it's about risk tolerance for the exec management, for the InfoSec team, for the people that use the tool, when you understand that and you can talk about risk tolerance to the people that make the decisions, they're going to get on board with what you're doing. So that's it for me tonight. I do appreciate your time, but that doesn't mean we have to end the discussion here. I'm sure there's people in this call that have had to deal with selling it to their InfoSec team. This would be a great time for people to sort of chime in and tell us about your experiences, what has happened for you. If you have anything to add, please let me know. But that's it for tonight. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the recording here.